And all of a sudden, I'm missing all of my notes. So the last thing that we need to talk about as far as the male reproductive system goes is the actual structure of the penis. Yes. There's lots of stuff from yesterday. There's my notes. Okay, the penis has two functions. Number one, through the urethra, it conducts the urine to the outside of the body from the kidneys, or from the bladder, I guess. And of course, the other function is to introduce semen into the vagina. So today we should get far enough that we'll start talking a little bit about fertilization and where it takes place. Let's see, do I have a picture? No, I guess I don't. So I should have another picture because we tend to break the penis down into three main parts. There's the root, which is not shown up here. The root of the penis is going to be erectile tissue that is actually connected to the pubic bones of the pelvic rib. It is actually anchored on the pelvis. And then the shaft, and then the glands. Sometimes also referred to as the head. Okay, now running through the shaft, you have two different types of tissue. One is called the corpora cavernosa, and there's going to be two sections of that run next to each other through the length. And then there's also the corpus sponginosum. Okay, those are the two types of erectile tissue. That tissue, it isn't muscle, it doesn't pull or anything, but it is a kind of a spongy epithelial tissue that has lots of holes in it. And during, I guess, the normal state, it is pretty much empty. And so the penis will be flaccid. But in an aroused state, blood rushes through there. And basically, just the filling of blood in the holes of the corpora cavernosa and the corpus sponginosum creates an erection. So that's why it's called erectile tissue. What Viagra does is it actually stimulates the dilation of blood vessels so that blood flow is improved. It was developed actually as a treatment for arterial sclerosis, I believe, to help open up the
and then, like, one of the
veins
side
and
effects,
arteries.
the first side effects must have, like, blown the guy's mind. It's like, what the heck is happening?
Yes, Viagra is an interesting case because it has been prescribed for what was the side effects to begin with. Okay.
And like 4 hours later.
It's like, why won't it go away?
Okay, around the glands is a fold of skin. It's not really shown well on here, but it's called prepuce. sometimes also known as the foreskin. And in some cases, that skin is removed in a procedure called circumcision. We're going to watch a couple videos that'll talk about that.
Oh, I'm gonna watch like a circumcision in that.
Yeah.
We're not going to watch an actual circumcision.
I'm glad.
It's working out.
You make it sound like it's a breakup.
Well, it is, isn't it? It's breaking up something.
I suppose that's true.
I suppose making
Yeah, I mean, that is an issue, though. The idea that you're making a pretty major decision for somebody who doesn't know any better. Okay, so it's pretty much all we need to cover as far as the male reproductive system, I think. All right, well, let's talk about the female reproductive system then.
Sure. I have a question that might give it too much information, but
Okay.
like, what is the use of, the hair down there?
Pubic hair? That's a good question. The major reason why we think humans have retained pubic hair, not so much warm, as actually to keep a moist area for pheromones and bacteria to give off certain scents.
I thought we didn't have pheromones.
We do.
No.
How much we're affected by those is up for debate, but that's the major, I guess, theory behind why we still have pubic hair. Okay. So female reproductive system, we can kind of split into 5 main parts. The ovaries, the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes or the oviducts, uterus, the vagina, and then external genitalia. We will not get to all of these today. Okay, so we'll start out with the ovaries. The whole point of the ovaries is to produce gametes. Just going to scroll this down a little bit, I guess. Start with the ovaries. So the ovaries are the female gonads. They produce gametes in a sequence of events called oogenesis. But that's not their only function. They also produce hormones that are important for the female sex cycle and the female ovulation cycle. Estrogen and progesterone. Or no, not progesterone. Sorry. I got mixed up.
What is this estrone?
Would you like to teach tomorrow? Yeah, I would be happy to get you up here.
When are you teaching tomorrow?
Sorry, just a minute. I got mixed up on my hormones. Progestin.
They don't use prolactin.
Prolactin.
That's the food that
Yeah. Okay, now oogenesis is quite a bit different than spermatogenesis, though. For one thing, whereas spermatogenesis is constantly making sperm, in females, oogenesis starts, and the first part of it kind of completes before the girls are even born. So in the first few weeks of life, actually the whole reproductive cycle is getting started. So, yeah, we'll come back to that. This is the inside of an ovary. Okay, there's a few different parts to it we'll kind of get to. It's actually not the one I was after. I seem to have lost the picture that I actually wanted to show. All right, well, that's fine. We'll just go from here. Okay, so in oogenesis, we start with a stem cell. Okay, and while the girl is still in the womb developing, those stem cells are going to go through mitosis to produce a certain type of cell called an oogoneum.
So we're talking about like a girl that's not born yet is starting the oogenesis.
Yes, they are starting to produce ova.
I thought what you meant was like she had a baby in her and then she started oogenesis. I'm like, wait, how does that happen?
Yes.
What is that?
Oogonia. Okay. These are the cells that are produced through mitosis from the stem cells. And these are the things that are going to eventually divide to become the ova, the eggs that are produced for fertilization. Okay? But because mitosis has taken place, of course, these are not gametes yet. The oogonia are just copies of the stem cells, basically. So they're going to have to go through meiosis. Now, if you remember, meiosis has two parts. There's meiosis 1, which is going to end up producing 2 haploid cells. And then there is meiosis 2, which is going to produce, from those 2 haploid cells, each of those will divide to produce 4 haploid cells. Okay, so in the first, what we call the first meiosis, the nucleus divides in a way that the chromosomes get separated, so they become haploid, and then they go through another division, so they end up with 4 haploid cells overall. And here's the weird part. While still in the womb, in the ovaries, the female's cells are going to start meiosis 1. So before the girl's ever born, all of her eggs have started going through, or we shouldn't say eggs, but all of the things that will become the ova will have started going through that first meiosis stage, but they stop at prophase 1. And all of those eggs will be rested at prophase 1 until puberty starts and ovulation starts. So they're basically, they're ready to go, right? They're sitting there just waiting for the signal, but they will sit there until puberty. Because that's when ovulation will start. Okay, now during the actual ovulation, then the cells are going to go finish up meiosis 1. Okay, we'll be talking about this, what happens during ovulation in a little bit here. Ovulation. They will finish meiosis 1, and they'll get started into meiosis II. But then they'll stop again. And those cells that are released during the ovulation are in an arrested phase of prophase 2, and they will not go through the second division to produce an actual gamete until fertilization happens. So it isn't until a sperm cell comes along and fertilizes, gets through the outer layer, that the actual ova itself ever comes about. So it takes stimulation from a sperm cell to finish meiosis II. So even though females started working on their the whole process of producing gametes way before they were ever born, they don't actually finish it up almost ever unless fertilization happens. So we should go finish here. The other thing that's really interesting about the whole process of oogenesis is that when we say we get 4 haploid cells here, and that sounds like it's just like spermatogenesis. You get 4 cells. But the problem is, only one of these cells is actually worth anything. You get 1 ova and 3 of what we call polar bodies. And the reason is that ova has to be the starting point for the embryo that is going to form after fertilization. So that ova's got to have like as much stuff in it as it can as far as organelles and cytoplasm and all that. And so instead of dividing 4 separate times and every cell getting an even amount of the cell organelles, basically in the ovaries, the cells are going to divide in a way that 1 cell gets all of the resources. So even though through the meiotic divisions we should get 4 haploid cells, we really only get 1 that is viable. And the other 3 are just ways to kind of separate the chromosomes and make sure that we have the right chromosome number for the fertilization to be possible.
Does the ova keep the other haploid cells?
I don't know that it fits them. No, it doesn't absorb them or anything.
Well, so that was the polar body when you showed the that ova thing when it was dividing.
I guess I didn't notice that.
So that was a polar body. That's my head canon.
Okay. Is that you're talking about when I showed the ovary?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That like, no, it's way back.
I don't know what you're talking about. Okay. So yeah, that's how gametes are produced. Oh, one thing I forgot to talk about. Up here we talked about how these cells will stay in this kind of suspended animation until puberty kicks in. Well, about 3/4 of those cells will eventually just kind of dissipate. Okay, they're lost. So over the course of, say, from birth until puberty kicks in, about 75% of the cells that were set up that could have eventually become ova kind of dissipate, they degenerate, they get absorbed back into the system, and they don't ever get pushed on to actually become ova. So that sounds like a big waste, but most females start out with about 2 million cells to begin with, 2 million things that could eventually become an ova. So you're still ending up with a quarter or sorry, 500,000 cells. Only generally one gets released during an ovulation cycle, so still got plenty of cells to give on.
And that's why girls have like menopause when they run out of cells or
No, they don't run out of cells.
you know.
Dude, 500,000. Think about that.
Yeah, that's like every month. That'll last like 50 years or so. I don't know.
It's like 600 months.
All right,
600.
let's see this.
600 is much less than 500,000.
12 times 50.
Uh,
12 times 7.
yeah, it's going to be so much bigger if you do it times 70. Good Lord.
Never mind.
All right, let's talk about ovulation. Okay, now ovulation is a monthly cycle in which a ovum that is ready for fertilization is released, and fertilization happens and turns into a baby. If it doesn't, things kind of go through steps again to prepare for the next month. It's on about generally a 28-day schedule, but it does vary from female to female. Now, ovulation and menstruation are two different cycles. We'll be talking about menstruation probably tomorrow. They are tied together hormonally, but they are not the same thing. Most of the females probably know that. I would bet Eric doesn't.
I didn't hear you.
I know. So, steps of ovulation. The first step is formation of the primary follicle. And that's shown in this diagram above. This is controlled by a hormone called follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. And this whole process of ovulation, each step is going to be controlled by amounts of hormones, which is why, of course, hormonal birth control works to control the ovulation cycle. Okay, so if we look up here, we've got these primary follicles. So this follicle-stimulating hormone, when it gets released into the ovaries, it will cause some of these cells that are going to be associated with specific things that can become ova, so those specific oognia, to surround and start building up kind of a protective layer around that thing that could eventually become an ovum. And will start growing and hopefully get released from the ovary. Okay? Now, what's going to happen here is there's going to be a bunch of these that start out, right? But then there's kind of a weaning out process. And by the time you get to a secondary follicle, there's basically just one that is ready to be released. So some of these things that get surrounded are not going to make it. They're going to get reabsorbed by the system, and they're not going to be able to become an ovum. By the time you get to that secondary follicle, it's basically been narrowed down to a single one. There can only be one. So in each process, every month, one follicle will be released.
stomach too?
What's that?
Are there any disease that you get, especially up to second or more?
Not that I know of. Now, what's going to happen, I believe, is that each ovary is going to basically take a turn, okay? And so in some cases, you can have both ovaries that release one, and then there you have a potential for fraternal twins to form, because they could be, you know, not conjoined, fraternal, meaning they're just no different than any other brother and sister. No, you would not be able to have, well, I shouldn't say you would not be able to, but it'd be very unlikely to have fraternal conjoined twins because they start out separately. Conjoined twins, you know, are going to start out as the same egg, and they're just going to, the differentiation's not going to kick in right. Okay, what was I going to say? Interrupted my train of thought.
I think it's bad,
Again.
For fraternal conjoined twins, because I think it's 4 for the parts too.
Okay, so the third step here is the production of a mature follicle, which is ready to be released. Sometimes called a tertiary follicle. Okay, and just before it's actually released into the oviduct, then we have hormone stimulation. Which is going to cause the ova to go through that, to finish up that division and finish meiosis 1. So all the way up until this point, the mature follicle is ready. It's still in that suspended animation, but then the hormones cause that last division in the meiosis 1 to take place, and we produce 2 things that will become polar bodies, and 1 thing that will become an ova, and 1 polar body. Okay, so up here we have the oocyte, the egg cell, basically. It's in this mature follicle. It's ready to be released. The follicle is going to break down and release the ova into the fallopian tube, into the oviduct, and it will be radiated off. So here's one that has kind of burst apart. It has let the ova out, and you've got this egg cell that's ready to be fertilized. So we have release of the ova into the oviduct. And this is what we call right here, specifically, even though this whole cycle is part of ovulation, when we say ovulation, this is what we usually mean. It generally happens in around 14 days into the cycle. So once that first follicle is stimulated to start growing, it takes about 14 days to get to the point where it has grown, matured. All the other ones have kind of died off as fast. It's been reabsorbed, and then this thing is getting let out into the fallopian tubes, ready to be fertilized. Okay, and then number 6. If no fertilization, restart the cycle. Okay, now if fertilization occurs, there's going to be certain chemical signals that are going to basically limit those hormone releases, and so the ovulation isn't going to start up. Now, breastfeeding after birth can actually kind of keep up those signals so that those hormones are not released. And so a lot of women, and we'll talk about this when it comes to menstruation as well, a lot of women don't experience ovulation or menstruation while they're breastfeeding. I mean, it does differ, but a lot of them won't until they're done breastfeeding, whenever that is, after their baby's born.
We just can't tell the
Okay. Now, what's interesting is, so here's the ovary, right? The release of the ovum is going to be into the fallopian tube or the oviduct, and that there's going to be cilia in here that are going to move the ova from the ovary down towards the vagina. Towards the uterus, I guess. It's not going to make it into the vagina. So the cilia move the ova, but actual fertilization is going to happen in the oviduct, in the fallopian tube. Okay? If the ova makes it all the way to the uterus without being fertilized, it's pretty much done. It can't be fertilized from that point on. It's too late. There's a very narrow window here. And so the actual fertilization happens while the ova is still in the fallopian tube. Once it's fertilized, it gets moved, it continues moving towards the uterus. It will then attach to the wall of the uterus and grow into a baby if it can. But every once in a while, that ova, after it's been fertilized, doesn't actually make it to the uterus. It gets stuck, and we have what's called an ectopic pregnancy, also sometimes known as a tube pregnancy. In most cases, baby's not going to survive. They have had some luck in the last few decades with doing transplants, once they know that there's an ectopic pregnancy, taking the cells that are forming the baby and moving it to the uterus so that it can actually implant. In those cases, whether or not it implants and is able to continue growing is going to depend on a lot of factors. A lot of times the baby will die in that case. But it will risk the health and the life of the mother if you just keep letting it grow in the fallopian tubes. Baby can't grow there. It's not going to make it. Okay. And I guess the last thing I'll say is one way for preventing pregnancies is to have the tubes, the fallopian tubes, tied so that ova cannot make it to, and sperm can't make it to the ova to fertilize them, but ova can't make it down to the uterus to get implanted.